It's a real pleasure to be here. And this is a sort of a continuation of the lecture I did at the NoBIAS onboarding week. So I hope all of you remember, and hopefully we can sort of develop what we talked about then a little bit further. And for those who were not in the onboarding week because they're not ESRs in the project, please do not worry. My idea is that in this event today, the ESRs who are in the NoBIAS project can sort of bring their expertise from the previous session and sort of feed it into the discussion here. But it's also perfectly possible to participate when you have not been to the onboarding session. Just as a fair warning to the ESR, some of the stuff may be familiar, and if it is, that's great, because then that means you've actually remembered. The topic of my talk is AI and research ethics, theory and practice, and it is a very practical thing that I'm trying to do today. There are going to be a few slides and a bit of input, but there's also going to be an opportunity to discuss. We're going to break out into groups and we're going to do a little exercise as well. Okay. So yeah, as I said, I'm building on the lecture in the NoBIAS onboarding week, where the focus was, and again is today, on ethical decision making in research, and in particular it's intended to help everyone in the project with ethical decision making in their research projects, whatever they may be. In any research, various ethical decision points arise, and particularly if you work with data gathered from social media or other sort of new data sources, usually those ethical decision points somehow arise in connection with the data that is being used in the project. Okay, let me see if I can, okay. I hope that you will remember that one of the basic, hang on, okay, I did one, I was lost, okay. I skipped a slide. Here we go. Okay, so I hope that you remember from the session in March, that was it April, that the basics of research ethics are that the researcher and the research itself should not harm anyone. So they should not cause disadvantages to anyone. And those disadvantages or those harms could be physical, but they could also be psychological. And in March, we looked at a few terrible examples of research gone wrong in the past. And that's, of course, how research ethics has developed over the years. Things have been tried, things have been done, others have said, okay, this is not how we should be doing research. And then guidelines were developed, best practices were come up with, and so on. But the foundational or the fundamental questions have remained the same. What should we do in our research and why? And what are the consequences if we do this research for others, for society, and who may be affected particularly negatively by what I'm doing in this research project? And those questions seem very simple, but they can be very tough ones, depending if you think them through, and they can be very different. There can be very different answers to these questions depending on your research project, but they are the same for every research project, no matter which discipline you are in, or from what background you're working in, or whether you're working theoretical or practical or empirical or more programmatic or whatever. A big principle that people have come up with in research ethics is that of informed consent, with the idea that research should not be done with people who haven't consented to being part of a research project. So participation in any research study should always be voluntary, and the participation should be informed. That means the person who participates in the research project somehow should be informed about the goals and the methods of the research, who is going to do what, how is it going to be done, what is going to be used for, and so on. And this also includes that participants have, in principle, a right to control their personal information. So they must be able to withdraw consent at any time in the process. So personal data particularly can only be recorded and processed with participants' consent. And even before the age of the internet, you can see that there may be problems with informed consent, or it may be difficult to actually achieve informed consent. People may say they are fine, but they haven't maybe understood what the project is actually about, or it may not be possible to ask them without compromising on the method, and so on. One way to ensure that best practice is adhered to, and also that people's privacy is addressed is sorry, I'm on holiday. I think you can notice from my background. So I'm trying to wrap my head around all of these issues again. Having just had two days with tractors and grape harvesting. Okay, so one way of ensuring that privacy concerns are addressed is to anonymize data. It's also a very practical a way of addressing issues around informed consent. So from a practical point of view, if people withdraw their consent years later in the process of a research project where it's already been published and so on, if all the data and all the results have been anonymized, it's not possible to find out what point of data was exactly theirs and to withdraw it from the process. So it's a very practical and useful thing for researchers as well, to allow them to actually do research without worrying that it may be at some point compromised by people withdrawing informed consent. And it also addresses the issue of privacy. So really in the past, anonymization and informed consent have been the absolute gold standards for any research involving human subjects. And then now, and as I said, they've always been problematic. It's always been difficult to achieve, and sometimes, doubtful whether it has actually been achieved, both anonymization and informed consent. But the challenge that we're facing at the moment, and have been facing for at least since the 1990s, is that the emergence of new technologies really challenges how we go about with these best practices in our research. And what is more, they show really deep conceptual gaps in how we think about ethical problems and how we are actually able to address them. One example, and this is what I already showed in the onboarding week. So, but I'm going to go a little bit further than I did then. So the issue with privacy in the social age, with people being on social media, is that they may be making public personal data. So then the problem is that formally, or it is public data, and but actually we have no idea what expectation they have of their content, whether they assume that it's completely private or whether they assume that it's public. And we cannot assume that they are completely aware how public the data is. And the seminal paper on this issue has been written by Michael Zimmer, but the data is already public, where he said, well, it looks like the data is public, but actually if you look at what people are assuming, it may be completely different. So there's a contextual nature of data sharing, particularly across platforms, and users may not be aware of how public content is. And really, you have various sort of in-betweens and grades of publicness, and you don't have a simple dichotomy into public, private, as there used to be. Well, if there ever was, but there definitely is no longer a sort of simple binary of public, private. but many shades of in between, and many different assumptions about different types of data and different content being shared on or across different platforms. And anonymization is even more difficult. It's difficult or impossible to achieve with social media data. So, for example, the simplest example, and I'm sure you all know about this, but I'm trying to start from the beginning. If you have a tweet and you just remove the poster's name, then you can still Google the tweet and you will find who wrote it. You can try and change the tweet, but then even if still some important words or terms remain, you may still be able to find the original tweet. And there may be some uncertainty whether you've actually found the correct tweet or not. So in that case, I would say there's been a successful hiding of the original poster's identity, but it has in general just become really difficult to achieve anonymization. And in addition, it's very easy to find out many things about people from very little information. And this is the first exercise. But because I'm only seeing my slides and myself, just to make sure, are there any questions? Is there anything that was completely unclear up to now? Is there anything anyone would like to add?
So far, no questions.
Okay, thank you, Sierra. You're monitoring the chat. So if there's anything, please at any time interrupt, write a question, just ask me stuff. Right, so as a little exercise, what I would like to try for you to try is to try and take one person in that you can see in the participant list. And I do think that people can see the participant list, right, Sierra? Yeah, if you could just use the person below or to the right of you, depending on your view. And just for 5 minutes, try to find out something about them that may be surprising for that person that you have found out. Just using the internet and just trying to find out something. And please don't post it in the general chat. You may want to post it to the person. And then hopefully everyone will post something to someone, and someone will also post something to them. And the idea is that just to see, because we are all so aware that the internet is public and that there's so much information about us out there. And there's also the practice of Googling oneself, and there's all of these tools that now, particularly as academics, help us to monitor and to manage our own visibility as scholars, and to ensure that our publications are visible. But still, in this exercise in the past, what I've noticed is that still stuff happens that is surprising, even to people who are, who can be expected to sort of already be aware of the fact that the internet holds a lot of information about everyone. So yeah, I'll not give an example, not to spoil it, but I can give it after we've done this. So I would like for everyone to try this for the next 5 minutes, and I'll try and see if I can somehow get my clock working. Okay, so I'm not sure it worked. I can see a few sort of tick marks next to attendees. So I hope that means that there were some successes. I can maybe tell one little story about how this worked for me for the first time, because I thought it was very interesting and revealing. So we did this at a conference workshop, and someone just found my Twitter, and then they saw a picture that I had posted the previous day, and then they realized from the angle that they were actually in the hotel room next to mine. So I thought that was quite surprising, and also showed that when posting this picture, I had in no way sort of thought about other information that people may have. So they may be staying in the hotel room next to me, so they may know the exact view, which will then tell them a lot more about this particular picture than just the picture, you know, in itself seems to be carrying when you post it on Twitter and just assume this sort of audience, possibly in my case, far away in Europe, who will then want to see the picture from my hotel room in the US. Okay, and the problem that we have when we consider this and when we think this through for our research projects is that anonymization is very, very, very difficult to achieve. So anything that we've been doing in the past that has been intended to protect research participants by anonymizing their data may no longer work. And the second problem with anonymization that we're having is that quite often now anonymization is very easily possible, particularly if we're using data or large amounts of data for research. But then the problem, or then the issue may be that even though we have anonymization, there may be other important ethical concerns that anonymization does not address, and the problem is no longer the actual real world. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by this. So, but just to start, a focus on privacy and a focus on anonymization may no longer necessarily address important ethical concerns or may even hide important issues. So let's see at why this is. So we've started with, or I've already mentioned that because something is shared online or available without a password, the author is not consenting to it being harvested for research. So they may not be aware that it is even used for research. They may have formally clicked on the terms of service to consent to the information being used for all sorts of purposes. But we have enough research now to know, and our own experiences as well, where we don't read the 74 pages that Apple sends us on our iPhone every few months when they update their terms of service, that this does not actually represent informed consent in the sense that it's originally intended to be like. So it's not that we actually know what the particular research is going to be about or what the particular use of the data is going to be about and who is going to do what with our data. And really, informed consent has sort of come to a limit. We could try and make ever better informed consent forms and try to make them easy, but there's come a point where if we were, you know, we don't even know often what the data is going to be used for in the future or how methods are going to be developed. And if we were really truthful and said, oh, we're going to be using the data for all sorts of purposes, we don't know yet what methods we're going to apply, then that would not be an informed consent that anyone would want to sort of sign or agree to in the first place. And then second, it also again sort of, you know, would then entail having to approach people again and again throughout the process, and it's just become completely impractical. So yeah, even if we recognize that a user making something public online has specific assumptions and expectations about who can access the data and for how, why, and for what, we need to monitor this throughout the process. We need to continue to look at it, and it will change over time. So the question is, do we put more and more effort into trying to inform people and to get informed consent? And, you know, I would argue yes, but we also need to do something else, because clearly there are very, very strong limits to what we can achieve with informed consent, particularly if it's only done once in the process. So to address the issue of anonymization and the that's also connected to informed consent. A problem that we're currently having is that for a lot of methods that are being employed, both in research and more generally by various actors on the internet, it's no longer important to know who exactly you are in order to apply these methods. So, hang on, I can only ever see half my screen. So even if people don't know who I am, from specific data points they have about me, they can still offer me, for example, personalized services or advertising. And it's become possible without knowledge of the legal real-world identity to still apply problematic practices of controlling or monitoring, or at least attempting to apply these practices, even without actually knowing who the particular people are, or by coming up with such methods with the consent of only a few. And then the methods can be applied to a lot of people who have not given their consent and who are anonymous in the traditional sense, so that really their information is not linked to their actual offline real world identity. So it has become possible to draw various conclusions about the individual that could not be known before in the absence of what has usually been called identifiability or personalization. So this causes a huge problem for the issue, if we address ethical concerns that we have about people's usage of data for research by the tools of informed consent and anonymization. So if it's possible to infer from the characteristics of some to those of others whose consent to the research is then no longer necessary, then what, who should we ask? Whose interests should we think about when we think about whether we should be doing a specific research project, or whether we should be continuing down this path or this path when we make a decision about how to further continue with our research. So to sort of, summarize this bit, a focus on increasingly sophisticated privacy practices and methods does therefore not only hold very little promise, but, and that's a bit of a problem, it may even obscure the real problems. So if in this situation we are then asked to show that we've anonymized the data and that we've asked the few people who have, who we're using to infer things about a much larger population, and who we've actually asked for informed consent, if we're then asked to prove that we've done that and that's it, and then best practice, research best practice has been addressed, and we have some sort of seal that, this is now ethically okay research, then this constitutes a big problem, because it hides that there are much larger issues at stake, or completely different things that we should be thinking about. And then the focus should rather be on the purposes for which the different data is then used. So Barocas and Nissenbaum have summarized this very well in this statement, I think. It's from an article they wrote a few years ago, Big Data's End Run Around Anonymity and Consent. It was first published in a journal, but it's just now been republished in the Book of Anonymity, which I thought I would quote here, because it is a very, very interesting and very new book that has just come out about a lot of the conceptual gaps that are occurring with issues of consent and privacy and anonymization that used to be the things that we needed to address, and that if we had taken care of those, we were sort of mostly fine in our research projects. So they write, where, for example, anonymizing data, adopting pseudonyms, or granting or withholding consent makes no difference to outcomes for an individual, we had better be sure that the outcomes in question can be defended as morally and politically legitimate. So the point that I'm trying to make, and that Barocas and Nissenbaum are trying to make, is that if these practices of anonymization and informed consent have sort of reached their limits, then we need to really make sure that we know what we are actually trying to achieve and what the data and the research results that we're producing are going to be used for. And they are not only addressing research, they are sort of addressing the much wider issue of a data society with various actors, but it does hold true for research in particular. Okay. This is the Book of Anonymity, if you're interested. It's you can download it for free, and you can also buy it. I do recommend to buy it because it's very, very thick, and it's just a lot easier to read. So what do we have? We have a situation where there are data generating systems that are designed to hold and that are implemented to generate very large amounts of data that are not originally designed to hold research data. And by using such platform data, we also become complicit in such platform surveillance and practices, and in business practices that aim to generate value out of data. And in fact, some of the methods that we may be using in our own research are very similar, or use similar sort of ideas. And a way, so what can we now do? How should we address this issue, where the sort of things that we had structures for, that we had forms for, that allowed us to very easily address ethics issues, if those have come to an end? How can, in this situation where we have become complicit and where we've where we can't follow sort of certain tools or rules that we used to have in the past, what can we now do? Well, we can try and ask ourselves questions and ask questions of others. And this is what is at the heart of a so-called responsibility approach to ethics. So that's the idea that the researcher is capable and willing to be moved, both in an affective and an kinesthetic sense. So it's the practice of making oneself available to respond without knowing ahead of time which phenomena will call one's attention, or what form the response should take. So it's a sort of taking action, or sort of taking back control over the research ethics issues in our own projects. If it's no longer possible to sort of address them with the tools and the structures that we've traditionally been provided with, then we need to sort of draw the decision back into ourselves and try to find ways in which to make these decisions, and to find both the points at which decisions need to be made and the tools and the ways in which to make the decision ourselves, by being by responding to what we see and what we find, and by then trying to address these issues. It sounds very difficult and complicated, but in fact, it's always been the case that every way in which it has been tried to sort of formalize and to structure ethics has only been able to address the ethical issues that arise in a research project up to a certain point, and there's always been a limit to what parts of ethical decision making within research can actually be outsourced to such external actors. It's not to say that they are not important, and they do filter out a lot of research that should absolutely not be done. But as it is the nature of research to be at the forefront of innovation and to come up with new ways to think about things, as well as with discovering new things, it's sort of always been the case that the last mile of ethical decision making rests within the researcher herself or himself. So the idea is to not close oneself off from research subjects, not to do research as a distance, and not to see research ethics as something that can be outsourced. I introduced these very briefly, but just in case someone has forgotten, I wanted to mention again the guidelines by the Association of Internet Researchers, because they are intended to facilitate exactly these decision-making processes in individual research projects, how heterogeneous and innovative they may be. They ask, rather than giving you rules, they ask a lot of questions that are then for the individual researcher to answer. And they come in several installments. They are updated every few years. And the newest ones are particularly interesting because they have a large chapter that asks a lot of important questions of those in particular who are doing AI and machine learning research. Yeah, here just some screenshots of it. So before we start the very practical group work exercise, are there any questions? Let me see if I can see the chat. I'm sure I'll be able to.
No questions so far.
No questions so far. Anyone have any questions? Please ask them now.
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. Ask them now. Please wake up now. The group work is starting. Okay. Oops. So what I would like you to do is to split up into two Google Docs and to discuss the cases I've put in there. Both the Google Docs are identical, so everyone will have an opportunity to discuss the same questions and to look at the same cases. They are two cases. Very briefly, they are outlined in a little box at the top. Please just go into one Google Doc, and if you notice that there's already a lot of people in there, then maybe go to the second so that we have a more or less even distribution. I'm going to post the links to the Google Docs also in the chat, and I'm going to leave the Google Docs open, so you can also at a later point in time look at the other Google Doc just to see what others discuss and whether it was any interesting or whether they came up with different ideas. I've posted questions in the Google Doc that I think may be good for you to discuss, that are around issues or that are around the idea of trying to think through who may be affected by a specific piece of research and whose interests may we need to address. Who in this specific setting should we make ourselves respond to or make responsible to? Whose interests should be addressed and how could this be done? So those are the questions I posted in the Google Doc. You could also discuss completely different questions. I've already put the questions in there. You can just input any ideas you have in there. I would suggest that in order to facilitate a bit of an exchange between you, what you could do, if you see something that someone else has written that you think is particularly important, you could increase the font size. And then, maybe other people will also increase the font size, and you can sort of see a little bit how people, whether you share specific concerns or ideas about the particular case that I've posted. Yeah, as I said, in both Google Docs there are two cases. If you have any questions, then please post them in the chat. I will also go into the Google Docs. So if there's any questions there, then also please let me know. So it's let's meet, I would say, let's use the next 20 minutes. So it's 11:45 now. Let's meet again at 12:05. Yeah, but I'll be obviously here in the WebEx anyway, so please do come back if you have any questions. And at 12:05, I'll try and use a little bit from what you've written in the chat in the Google Docs, and I'll draw it all together over here. So I would invite everyone to sort of mentally come back to our WebEx room. But of course, you can leave the Google Docs open, or maybe also look at the other Google Doc. Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this exercise in such an engaged way. There were some really interesting things being posted in both of the groups. I'll try and summarize it a little bit, and if you think that I've completely missed something, then please do let me know. Yeah, so the first example was a sort of very traditional example. If you want of internet research, someone is interested in the personal finance subreddit and wants to do some research on it, and yeah, so even the questions asked or the way the scenario is written is very much on the issues of who is the data, whose data is this, could people be re-identified? We can imagine that personal finance may be something that is sensitive to people and as a topic per se. So for the question of should the research be performed, why and why not, there were quite a few people there was the argument that there's a very legitimate interest by the researchers to conduct such research. There was also people who said, well, it should they should ask for consent. They should do more, you know, probably depending on how they're going to use particular information or particular quotes, possibly to ask more than just the moderators. They should ask individual people. There were also some further questions around, well, how does it make a difference? How do the particular data practices and the particular methods and the way in which the data is used and stored, how does that matter? So does it make a difference how I obtain the data? Does it make a difference how the data is stored, how it's used and how it's analyzed? There was some discussion around what identifying information may be in this context, and around the question of who actually should get to decide. And I think that echoes a lot of what I tried to say in my lecture before, that it's become very difficult to disentangle both who the people are who will be affected by a specific piece of research, but also that it's a lot maybe less clear who should be making decisions about the research and who is equipped to make these decisions. And you know, should I be making this decision? Should someone else be making this decision? And who should be making such decisions? Yeah, then around the second example was much less sort of a traditional research example as we may have already you know, experienced it ourselves, because it was about Netflix's data practices. So with the idea that what they are doing is also research, and maybe using very similar methods to researchers or other people the quote is a tweet that was very controversial a few years ago, because for the first time at that point, a lot of people realized that Netflix was doing such analyses of viewer behavior in a lot of detail. And following this tweet, there was a bit of a discussion in the newspapers and in the general media about Netflix data practices, and possibly some of you may even at the time have read about this. So the interesting, I think, one of the very interesting things that you wrote in the Google Docs was that there is a very, that almost everyone seemed to be fairly fine with the fact that there is a legitimate interest by Netflix to analyze viewer behavior. And it may even be beneficial for the viewers, to get a better program, and it's absolutely legitimate that Netflix will, they are a business and they are trying to make a profit, obviously. So it's completely fine if they are analyzing the viewing behavior, and if, and people will have consented to it somehow. And then it became quite interesting, because what then the issues are with other sorts of practices. So possibly with the fact, that maybe not by Netflix, but by other actors, data may be sold on to third parties who then do who knows what with it. And at that point, the consent that has been given, even if no one has actually read the actual terms of service, but the expectation of the users regarding the consent would be violated, because more or less there may be quite a few people who have consented to Netflix analyzing their viewing behavior, but they will not probably have expected for the data, for example, to be sold on to someone else. Not that Netflix is doing that, it's just the example. And that, I think, shows very well the sort of the limits, that both the importance of consent, but also the limits of consent. And so if we have only formal consent, and then this enables actors who we do not want to analyze specific behavior or data, how can we then ensure that they are not doing it if consent is the only instrument that we currently have? Yeah, would anyone like to add anything? I mean, this has obviously been a summary by me, and I've just, I thought there was a lot of other interesting stuff that you wrote, but maybe something that you thought was really important I haven't said yet. So would anyone like to add anything? Just let me check the chat. I hope I've got the correct chat.
I don't see any hands raised. Oh, wait, yes, we do. Johan, I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
I mean, I think what might be an interesting aspect here is, I wrote this in the Google Doc, you were asking me whether I think it's okay or not. But I think,
yeah.
but I mean, I think with ethical questions in general, and also as it applies to research, the question is who actually should decide it? Who actually should finally make a judgment what is ethical or not, especially given the fact that we have so many different players here. We have like companies acting internationally versus small research institutes. We have the same questions arising in very different countries with very different cultural backgrounds. So we cannot just pretend that there is one true ethical way of doing things. So how should we actually decide who to follow, or how to figure out how to end up with these decisions? I really have trouble with this. And obviously I have an opinion, but why should my opinion be more like valid than the opinion of a Chinese researcher who tries to predict, criminality from races, to take a really extreme example here?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you also for your comment in the Google Doc. And yeah, no, I completely, absolutely agree. And maybe, well, I would say if that is what you're thinking about, then sort of my job has been done, right? And I know this is very unsatisfying, but to me, the point in this lecture, at least, was to point out that this is the problem, right? So who should be making these decisions? And they are so complex that it has become absolutely difficult to find out. Well, you know, it's become absolutely impossible for individual people to make this decision. But we also at the moment have no structures to make these decisions, and maybe to sort of condense the question a little bit and to make it really about something that is closer to what we are doing here, to make it about our individual research projects. So who should be making the decisions about what we are doing in our individual research projects? And then even there we have exactly this scenario that you just described, right? And the point that I'm making is we do need things such as ethical boards. We need codes of conduct by the specific communities. We need guidelines that we give ourselves as researchers, such as the Association of Internet Researchers guidelines, but they only go so far. We need a structure of supervision of PhD projects where we can, you know, in the traditional sense of academia, we can teach and learn from each other, and you know, have people who help us and who guide us and who encourage us, and who then maybe we also confront with new questions, and then they learn something and so on. So we need this academic system of exchange and debate. We also need places such as this summer school. And then when it comes down to it, in your individual research project, there's just no one who can make this decision for you, right? And then, you know, I mean, I know your question was a sort of a little bit, it went a little bit further. So there's a huge argument to be made, for example, for given states and the EU and, you know, all sorts of actors more power to regulate players such as Facebook. And, you know, that's sort of a different debate to the one I'm trying to address here. So my point here is it has become really complex, and there may be very different things to address. And if the Chinese researcher is part of your data, then, you know, maybe his view should be considered. And so the point is really that this is the right question to ask. And if you've gotten to that point, then, you know, I would say, okay, you can go and continue with your research, and you will probably somehow find ways to at least ask these questions. And I'd be more worried about projects that are not at this point, right? Where these questions are not being asked, because there is a sort of, well, there is a danger of just following the rules, and then, you know, it's okay and you just continue, but in fact it's, from an ethical point of view, it's not really okay, even though you followed the traditional rules, because things have become so complex. And I hope this is not too unsatisfying an answer, but that would be my answer. Any other questions? Would you like to reply to this?
Yeah, Johan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just waiting if anyone else wants to ask a question. I don't want to monopolize.
Welcome back, Johan.
But I was just thinking, I mean, I'm all for ethical behavior of all researchers on the globe. And obviously, I'm a researcher because I've always felt that what I do as a researcher does less harm than in many other companies, you know. But I think ultimately what you mentioned about regulation is really an important part, and maybe
Absolutely.
the job of researchers should be to kind of help or even make sure that regulation goes ahead. So, I mean, from my point of view, researchers need to get active so that politicians understand the problems, because they often don't understand the problems, that regulation addresses the correct issues. Again, something that researchers know much better than those who lobby for laws in the European or in the local administrations. So I think we need to do this, because otherwise we are the good guys. We follow very strict rules we set ourselves. And in the meantime, powerful international players don't give a damn at all about anything of this, because nobody can even check what they're doing, let alone regulate them. So I think it's really, really important that researchers get more active with regard to the political aspect of this, because that's the only thing that, you know, can change the way things are done in a democracy. So
Yes.
sorry, that was more an opinion than a question, but maybe my question is what's your opinion to this?
Yes. No, thank you very much. I think, no, that's absolutely great. And you're completely right. And I would encourage everyone to do that. And I think one way of doing this is to look at our own research infrastructures, because they are sort of where we are sort of linked to the more general way in which our communities are regulated, if you want. So, and one way of doing that is to, for example, look at the things that are happening around the usage of social media data and social media data archiving and social media data access, and to engage in that and to find ways to be heard as a community, and to come together as a research community, and to make sure that we have a stake, that we show that we have a stake in there and that things need to happen. And an actor who can sort of help with that a little bit is, for example, GESIS, because they are starting to look at how we can change research infrastructure. But there are also many other actors. So I would absolutely agree, with what you're saying, and I'm sure there are many ways to do this, and to go into politics or to change regulation. But one way that is fairly close to our everyday work is infrastructure work. And there are a lot of exciting things happening in infrastructure at the moment, on the funding level and on the level of getting communities together to speak with one voice. Particularly around the European ERICs. Those are communities of different country level infrastructures in the specific communities that come together to build connected infrastructures and to be bigger and to be able to be a voice, because a lot of this is about how we get data and what happens with the data. So data research infrastructures as they are connected in the ERICs are really important. Another one in Germany, for example, are the currently happening NFID, the nationale NFDI, sorry, nationale Forschungsdateninfrastrukturen, where completely new funding has been set up and new projects are starting, and really big changes are happening in the area of data and research data infrastructure. And I think those are really good points for us as researchers to influence how research infrastructure is shaped in the future. And that isn't something that only concerns research, but that is something that goes exactly into the direction that you're explaining. That is how does research in general, or how do communities overall speak with big internet companies? What right do they have? What right do the companies have? Who regulates it? So I think those are good starting points to address exactly these questions. But yeah, that's just one idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Next, we have a question from Myra. Go ahead.
Well, it wasn't so much a question, but thank you, Katharina,
okay.
for your presentation. Well, it was more yeah. You basically just said everything that I was thinking, because we cannot just assume that because we are researchers, we are the good people. You know, we also have a role to play in this, and on the research that we choose to do, on the data that we used to do, and maybe we also have to start humanizing the people included in the data sets that we're looking at. So yeah, I mean, you basically just said everything in when you addressed Johan's question. So, but yes, I was saying that we shouldn't just assume that we're the good people in the equation, and that we also have a role to play, and sometimes a lot of exploration as to where we want to head and how we can actually improve things instead of making it worse just by assuming that we're the good guys.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point, because, you know, it goes to this question of, well, if the data is very easily available, what does it mean if I use it? Do I become complicit in the way in which the platform has collected the data in the first place? And am I okay with the way in which this has been done? So thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for the absolutely excellent discussion in the Google Docs. As I said, I will leave them open and you can look at what the others wrote. I found it all really inspiring. If you have any questions at any point, do send me an email or approach me. Thank you so much for your insightful questions, and I've really enjoyed being with you.